Hello and welcome to On the Record, a debate-style television talk show where Bahamians will find the balanced, true and open debate you've been looking for. No new taxes, additional reductions on custom duties, and more money for small business development and changes in policies to facilitate environmental protection and ease of business. The Minister of Finance brought the government's new budget to the House yesterday, calling it a break from the past. Deputy Prime Minister Peter Turnquest said his administration will not bow to political expediency, but will again demonstrate the resolve to protect the long-term interests of the Bahamas and a prosperous future for all Bahamian citizens. He touted it also as the lowest annual fiscal deficit recorded in the Bahamas in 10 years. But what does it all mean for you and I? On this edition of On the Record, we're crunching the numbers as we look at the government's 2019-2020 budget. It's all on the record tonight. I'm your host, Jerome Sawyer. Our discussion begins on the other side of this break.
Matt, where in the world is Matt Lauer? Where in the world is Ellison Greenslade? And so these about the low value of cottage in Atlanta. So we can talk about it.
On the record tonight, the government's purchase of the Grand Lukine is a hot subject in the news. We're going to This is On the Record. The Deputy Prime Minister told the nation yesterday that we can report to the Bahamian people that we have improved our fiscal outlook. Our topic tonight is crunching the numbers, the 2019-2020 budget. My guest is Gowan Bowie. He's the outgoing president of the Bahamas Institute of Chartered Accountants. Gowan, welcome back to On the Record.
Thank you. Always a pleasure.
Whenever we see you, we know it's budget time. But certainly, this is an opportunity for us to discuss what was laid out to the nation via the House of Assembly in the annual budget communication yesterday. And this is an important time because it really speaks to two things, I think. One, what the performance has been over the past 12 months, the fiscal period, and then, of course, what the outlook is. I want to ask, firstly, from the perspective of the country and those who are involved in this whole business, what the Prime Minister says that what the Deputy Prime Minister says that we have improved our fiscal outlook. Is that an accurate statement from where you sit and from where the rest of the financial community sits?
Well, I think if we dispassionately look at it, you can't discredit that because we have reduced the deficits over the past few years. What we can debate is whether or not we've reduced the deficits in a manner that allowed us to continue economic growth. So we do know that some of the areas where expenditure has been curtailed has been on the capital expenditure front. And that may have a dangerous precedent in terms of me saving $1 today, is it going to cost me $2 tomorrow?
And when we say capital expenditure,
you're thinking about infrastructure,
right.
So your roads, your buildings, your utility infrastructure, elements that I'm going to say that lay the foundation for economic activity. And the government is a facilitator or provider of most infrastructure, so our docks, our airports, etc. And so a large part of the ability to reduce our deficits has been in terms of the holding back, if you will, on some of that expenditure. And the budget does speak to sort of reinvigorating some of that going forward. I think when we look at our fiscal situation, though, we also have to put into perspective, we as a small nation don't have the flexibility that we see of larger nations. And by that, I mean that we have to be very careful that what we borrow, we have an ability to pay back. And so, yes, the government of the day and previous administrations have the responsibility to ensure that our debt levels remain manageable. And that sometimes requires very tough decisions in terms of reducing spending.
That has been sort of the thrust and the mantra of this government from the very beginning. They said, you know, we are going, or we want to reduce the deficit. Have they been able to properly achieve that, and at the levels that they've been touting, or at the levels of which they had set the goals?
Well, I think they had a very aggressive agenda, and there's been criticism in terms of saying if you pull back too quickly, are you going to stagnate the economy, and are you going to actually push it into recessionary times again? And I believe that there has been a steady decline. As I said, if you look, I believe the initiative or the objective of ensuring that we get to a debt to GDP ratio that is manageable is one that we always have to have in the back of our minds, because we are on the hurricane belt. And we can run into a situation where expenditure will rush upon us without any warning. And we have to be in a situation that we can withstand it. When the global recession came about, we were fortunate that we were in, I would say, economic times where our debt to GDP ratio allowed us to increase deficit spending. The unfortunate part is, even when we came out of recession, I think once, as a government, and this is globally, once you start spending, to turn back the clock of time is almost impossible.
Where would you say, looking now just overall and at what would have been presented, where would you give the government high marks for its budget? I'm talking now over the previous budget, and where would you say that they have missed the mark or come in low?
Okay. I think what we have to be very pleased is the initiative going forward of institutional strengthening. If I were to say what is the biggest area that government can achieve efficiency and effectiveness, is by improving the quality of staffing. And that's not a criticism of individuals there. That is, let's put it into perspective. We have a $2.6 billion company, which is the revenue. How many qualified accountants exist in the actual government? So when you look at the Ministry of Finance, the Public Treasury, now you go into a Microsoft, a Google, or even a local Bahamian company, a Kelly's, a SuperValue, how many qualified accountants they have for even a fraction of that revenue. And I believe his indications of several initiatives, hiring qualified accountants, also looking at improving the systems, the chart of accounts, the quality of reporting, the quarterly results that they now do, and really demonstrating a commitment to move forward with that is probably the strongest message that he sent yesterday, because what it'll allow is making decisions, what I'm going to say, based on empirical evidence and not on gut feeling.
Right.
I think there's some other positives that we can chat on, but if I say where do we miss the mark, and it hasn't been, I would say, this budget, but we've always done, we really don't do a good enough job in terms of looking back and saying, where is it that we were successful, where is it that we were deficient, and what are we changing to correct the deficiency and maximize on the successes. So what do I mean by that? We know that we're coming in revenue short. The Deputy Prime Minister has been very candid and transparent with that. But what we have not really done is dissect, well, yes, we understand there were certain taxes not collected. You may not have had a full year of VAT at the rate that you expected. But is that a deficiency in the budgeting process? Because did we, if you will, have such a rigid budget that wasn't flexible to say, well, what if scenarios? So most companies have what I'm going to call the stress testing that will say, okay, this is my base case, but this is my optimistic case and this is my pessimistic case. And we don't do that. We kind of set out a budget, and then when we miss it, we kind of say, well, oh well, we've missed it.
What I don't often understand is you will have individuals who come from the business community where these normal practices or best practices take place in business, but it seems that when you get into government, there are different sets of rules, and all of a sudden, you know, good business sense, if I could use that, doesn't apply anymore.
You know, that still astounds me in the sense that we have to change the culture. And what I will say is, I think, at least from an oral commitment, the Deputy Prime Minister said that we have to change how we think about things in the actual government. So I think we have a lot of, well, this is how it's always been done. And we do need to shake it up.
We've been doing that for 30 years. You don't need to come in and change that. Yeah. No, that's
and you know, we have, I think oftentimes we forget that the ministers are what I'm going to call the CEOs, and these are the strategists. The persons underneath them are the persons who execute. And if you don't have the right mindset and the support, you are still going to be frustrated. And that isn't on them, because you do have to bring in what I'm going to say a change in culture mindset, but you have to also have change agents. So you need persons that you are getting on board to say, well, let me do it differently, and these are the benefits that we will reap when we do that.
We need to have that show in public sector reform. According to the Deputy Prime Minister, this is the first budget that will be fully enacted under the legal framework of the Fiscal Responsibility Act. This administration has touted this quite a bit. And included in that is the Fiscal Responsibility Council, comprised of 5 members with legal, business, economic, accounting, and financial backgrounds. Why is this so important to this government, and why are they touting this as really being, I guess, the change that's needed within our fiscal planning and even execution of these plans?
We've had, I'm going to say, external criticisms that we basically don't have a framework, legal or otherwise, that holds governments accountable for their budgets and their sort of spending and performance. And so fiscal responsibility legislation globally are pieces of legislation designed to effectively say, put color around what it is the government should be doing. So set metrics, set, if you will, accountability framework that says how do you come back, and if you have to change those metrics, the procedure for doing so. Up until this point in time, we've had our parliamentary debate, and yes, we have the arguments between opposition and government, but we haven't said, well, okay, this is what you set out as being the legal framework of what you must stay within. And now coming back to justify going outside of the parameters is going to, if you will, put an onus of responsibility not only on the members of parliament but the people underneath, because it has embedded in it penalties for actually behaving in the wrong manner, in the sense of, I'm not going to say draconian penalties like jail and others, but what I'm going to say is more transparency in terms of, well, this is when you failed. And when you look at a council that is expected to be independent, in the sense that it is not through political appointment, it is through the various skill sets that you mentioned when reading them out, this council has the awesome task of being very candid in its criticism, positive and negative. It has the obligation of, if you will, communicating to the people based on their expertise where government is going in the right direction and areas that it feels there should be a change of course. And I think it's going to be very important to see the maturity of government.
Well, you know, I was going to bring up the point that, you know, while these councils and these bodies are important, politicians get very sensitive when there is criticism for policy or criticism for a decision. And I guess outside of that, then what would be the next step if the council says, you know, what you have just done is not in the best interest of the country, or this was not the best decision, or it cost us this, and that information goes to the people, then what?
Well, that's why I say you'll see the maturity of the
Or lack
policy
thereof.
makers, or lack thereof. But what I believe is, what is going to be important is that criticism should not be taken personally when you sit in that seat, because you are elected to represent. And I think there has to be an appreciation that whilst you may be the individual in the seat is what really matters. And you are representing a constituent base, and you're representing the population. So when this criticism comes about, it should be taken for that, in terms of saying, how do I improve or how do I change? You know, none of these decisions should be personal decisions. And if you take it personally, then that's the first...
You're in the wrong business.
That's the first error, because it should never have been a personal decision you made. It should have been what I'm going to call a collective decision that says, we have a course that we're trying to go down.
I've taken the liberty of going through the minister's remarks and pulling out some points that I thought just were very interesting. We're going to use them, of course, as the basis for our discussion. But something he said really caught my attention. As a result of our in-depth review, we identified opportunities to surgically trim the budget, decrease fiscal inefficiencies, and reverse the historical pattern of improper planning resulting in over-budgeting with little outcomes. And he went in depth into a number of things that government and his ministry would have done to begin to streamline. For example, something that really stood out to me, they did sort of a wage and salary review, looking at the number of people within the service, or budgeting for people that were no longer there, or wages that no longer existed. And I thought, how is this allowed to carry on in the government?
And if we go back, and I think all of us have had experiences when we speak to various departments and agencies, that they say, child, I have to spend this money, else I'm going to get it back the next time.
Right.
we hear that
Yes.
too often. And that is, if you will, a function of bottom-up budgeting as opposed to top-down. And I mean by that we really should be saying, from the Ministry of Finance, we have finite resources. And this is what we are placing in your ministry, department, or agency. And you need to best manage that amount in order to achieve your objective. Because in life, we know that we have constrained resources. In our households, we would love to live in a mansion. We would love to eat the finest of foods, but we have a budget based on our earning. And the country is no different because it comes straight out of our pockets, and we should see it that way. So I think that when he made those comments, what I will say is what jumped out to me in those same comments, well, how is that allowed to continue? Because it goes to my very first comments around looking back. Because when I looked at expenditure versus the budget, are we saying that persons misrepresented that some of this were expenditure in personnel emoluments when it was something else? So what they did was they misclassified, and that to me is not only immoral but illegal, and persons should face consequences for that. Or we are not doing a good enough job of saying, well, when I look at actual expenditure, it didn't line up with budget. And when I go back to my allocation, I'm saying to them that I didn't see where it was necessary and you achieve your objectives without it. But I believe we have to be very hard in our position that we are allocating resources to achieve outcomes. Because our budgets still give allocations to what I'm going to say entities. It doesn't give it to programs, meaning that within education, if we're talking about high school education, primary education, tertiary education, are we achieving the results based on the resources being allocated, as opposed to saying, this is the budget that has been given to the Ministry of Education? Because if we don't get to program-based spending, it is very difficult to really assess whether or not the monies being deployed have actually earned value for money.
And that, with my limited background, that would seem to be like a basic premise of how you budget and do business.
Yes. In that regard. And
the government operates differently. So we're going to take a quick break. When we come back, more on the record. Stay with us. We're back right after this. Hello and welcome to On the Record, a debate-style television talk show where Bahamians will find the balanced, true, and open debate they've been looking for.
And the icon goes to On the Record.
On the Record was born out of a desire to do something different. What we do every day helps our country, it helps our society, it helps to shape the views and opinions.
Listen, what is more dangerous than corruption?
We've got to move very quickly. Let's wrap up.
Integrity.
It's all On the Record. I'm your host, Jerome Sawyer. Our discussion begins on the other side of this break. Welcome back. Our topic tonight is crunching the numbers, the 2019-2020 budget. My guest is Gowan Bowe. He's the outgoing president of the Bahamas Institute of Chartered Accountants. During the minister's presentation yesterday, he spoke to the global as well as the domestic economic conditions, giving reference to previous years. As for the domestic side, he said, as for recent developments in the domestic economy, preliminary national accounts data released this month by the Department of Statistics revealed that real GDP growth improved significantly to 1.6% in 2018 from a revised 0.1% real growth recorded in 2017. This outcome was supported primarily by more buoyant economic activity in several sectors, including real estate, wholesale, retail, trade, accommodation and food services, and financial and insurance services. Looking at that, how does that put into context where we are, and what does that speak to from an economic health side? I mean, what does that speak to, and what does that say to us?
What it really says is we're starting to see spending take place again. And we're starting to see that when we think about GDP, or the gross domestic product, really that's a function of how the economy is doing in terms of businesses expanding. But businesses only expand when persons feel that there's economic recovery, and they're now starting to spend again. So when we go into recession, whilst it may seem illogical, by you pulling out spending, it actually retracts the growth of the economy. But as an individual, when you're saying that I may have reduced employment, unemployment, I am not minded to continue to spend.
Of course.
So, you know, it's a hard sell to say to me, well, continue spending on the trust that will help
things
the
will
economy
get better,
to get better. So what it does say is at least we're seeing that optimism return. We are seeing persons start to effectively move into, when he says in these various sectors, it means that persons are now spending again where that had been contracted, where persons weren't doing real estate and renovations and had reduced their insurance cover, etc.
What I think, and sometimes as an individual, I know that I ask this question. These numbers are provided by the Department of Statistics and presented by a sitting government, in this instance, the Minister of Finance, who's the Deputy Prime Minister. And I sometimes ask, how reliable are these numbers? Are we sure this is what's taking place? And not to question anyone's involved, but how do you build confidence that this is, or ensure that this is the real picture?
Well, the first thing is we have to know that the staffing and the complement in terms of systems and processes that they're deploying is actually 21st century. So that we are using, you know, handheld devices to capture information instead of handwritten sheets. When we remember the consensus that used to be done, or the census, as in, when used to be done in the past, that we are looking at statisticians, we are looking at trained persons, so no different than my comment around having qualified accountants. Secondly, we have to be doing it in a timely manner, because having the information come out 6-8 months after the fact is of very little use in terms of persons who use it to project. And we too often have been relying on what I'm going to say outside bodies like the World Bank, IMF, IDB to project our growth. And that's something that I think in terms of pride, we should be saying that our national statistics should be ours. And it should be at a quality that any outside observer coming in places reliance on that. So that when they come in, all they're really doing is regurgitating what has been reported. And that is what we should expect. So when we see those numbers, I don't think it's a case of distrust in the individuals. I think it's around, do we have the right individuals, processes, and systems in order to provide information in a reliable and timely manner? And that is a big, big factor, because I would say that too often times, when we speak about revisions, is always to some external party's revision,
Right. So
as opposed to our National Statistics Department.
And how much, or is there enough reliance on what would have taken place in a previous budget when we talk about what we expect this time around? For instance, do we delve deep enough in what happened in the last period, and as a public, are we privy to enough information about what worked and really what did not work?
And that's one of the areas that I would say when you say, well, where does the budget fall short, that we, for my entire lifetime looking at it, we have never really spent 2 weeks, 3 weeks analyzing the actual performance of the government in a fiscal year. Our debate is always centered around the budget, but we do not go into saying, well, what were the fundamental issues that led to not meeting our budgeted targets?
The shortfall in revenue.
Or the surplus. I mean, we should be saying that, was it an error in my GDP numbers? Was it an error in what percentage of GDP I'm charging? Was it an overshoot in terms of I was aggressive relative to what I thought businesses could sustain or what I thought the consumer could sustain? And have I made revisions to the one going forward based on the experience that I've had? So I think that, you know, I'm not saying it's not being done, but it's certainly not in the same public sphere to say, let's sit down, because it's just like a public company. That really, when a public company has its annual general meeting, it sits down and says, this is the performance of the previous year.
You look at the previous
and
performance.
It says why we've done well and why we haven't. And then it also then sets out what our course is going forward. And I think that, one, we are so far behind in terms of our audited statements for government, Because when you look at the budgets, when they have the final numbers, there's always a revision to the previous year's outturn. And it goes back 2, 3, 4 years.
Yeah, you keep hearing these. We were tabling
we said
the
the
audit report
deficit was
3 years ago. Yeah, and I'm thinking, well, why is that relevant?
So we have to, and I think the DPM mentioned that they were strengthening the Auditor General so that we become more timely in that same regard. And that has to happen.
I did note that there is an increase in the allocation for the Auditor General's office and the work that they're doing. And I took note of that as an important step forward. One of the things that was an indicator certainly of the performance, national unemployment rose 0.6% to 10.7% in November of last year. When unemployment sits in double digits, that's a sign that things are not so good, despite what government wants us to think and what they're presenting.
And I think we have to be a little more discerning as it relates to the unemployment numbers, meaning that we get statistics in May and November. Traditionally, May has been election time, carnival time, some peak period where you have temporary employment.
And just before students come out of school.
All right, and just before, exactly. And then November is after they come out of school, and you have it there. When you look at the North America or European statistics, they come out every month. And so you actually have an understanding on what I'm going to call my actual structural unemployment. Like, what is the number consistently? And I think we hover between the 10.2 and 11. And, you know, when we move from the 10.8, that may be 10.2 come November, or this May, 10.2, then we jump for joy. And then we go back to November and it's back to 10.8. When in reality, it probably was 10.7 all along. Because when we strip out the anomalies that are taking place, it stays at a stubbornly high number.
But I've got to ask too, when you look at a 10.7 or 10.2, I want to put that into perspective. How is that, or how do you measure that in terms of the health of the economy? When you look at a double digit like that, what does that indicate to us?
Well, what it says to you is that businesses are still not expanding, that they are trying to do more with less. You do see some of that taking place in terms of automation and as we advance with technology, etc. But it effectively means that we have two concerns. One, businesses are not in a position to expand, or the economy is not expanding fast enough to absorb, because we have to remember that there are new employees or employable persons, if you will, coming out every year from school, whether it be university, high school. And so the economy has to grow at a pace to absorb them. But secondly, if the case is we have positions, are people employable, and are they coming out of school with the skill sets that would allow them to become employed? Because we too often have looked at our economy as what I'm going to call the service industry of saying, get a hotel job or get a construction job. And I think that has unfortunately dumbed down the economy, because it is said that you can make a very good living as a semi-skilled individual in the hotel sector or the construction sector, as opposed to saying, well, yes, I want you to be able to get a job when you come out of school, but I want you to have a skill set that says that as the times change, technology changes, you have the capacity to change with it. You can learn and change when those things take place.
You said the word employable, and that's so very important. Referencing again the presentation yesterday, the minister said, domestic prices rose moderately through 2018, largely reflecting the one-time effects of the increase in the VAT rate and the higher global oil prices. According to the All Bahamas Retail Price Index, inflation rose by 75 basis points to 2.3% over the year. However, the average cost for communications, clothing and footwear and education contrasted by registering declines during the year. Nevertheless, the increase in the overall price level did not appear to have an adverse impact on domestic consumption, as this component of the GDP grew over the year, especially for households. So put that into layman's terms.
In layman's terms, what it effectively means is $1 today is not worth $1 tomorrow. And so it effectively means that, okay, when I bought that tin of corned beef, well, tuna, because I'm vegetarian, last year it may have cost me 89 cents. In terms of the price of that item, I expect it to increase because things are going to take place. So what do I mean by that? There has to be profits that go into businesses. There has to be returns on your deposits when you place it into banks, when you invest in shares. So there's, if you will, a natural increase in prices that is saying that is being picked up, hopefully by persons, increase in their earnings so that they're able to spend. And so if you think about, and we hear it all the time, we remember when this item used to cost 25 cents. And over time, it has continued to increase. In certain countries, they have tremendous inflation, and there's a little more complicated when we start talking about monetary policy and making bad practice of printing money. So when they run short, they just go to the printer and say, I print money. But if you think about money supply and you have an abundance of it, it means that the price of an item, when I go into supply and demand, if I have all this excess cash, the price of the items is going to go up, because basically by having all that excess cash, the value of it is diminished. And so the Bahamas has been fortunate because we have not had what I'm going to say excessive inflation. When you think of South America, you hear about it in terms of hyperinflationary economies. We don't need to know the technical term. All we need to know is that they have economies where they are seeing price increases by 20%, 30% on an annual basis. And we know how we complain now. So when we say it's about 2-3%, that's a moderate increase that you expect, because when you think about your wages and salaries, when you think about the money that you earn, when you save, etc., ultimately you expect to have some return. And so if you say, well, things have to go up in order to compensate for that to be able to happen, 2-3% is not a bad number. And actually, recession and deflation is negative, because if it means prices are going down, it means that ultimately there's far more supply than there is demand.
We'll talk about this a little later, but certainly what has been the effect of that increase in value-added tax? We'll talk a little bit more about the numbers and what they put in terms of what government's collected. But how has that affected you and I, and also the wider economy?
I believe that the biggest impact has been the psychological impact, because when it was 7.5%, persons, when you added and you went into a restaurant, you said 15% and 7.5%, you saw 22. In reality, it only moved to 27, but I think that 27 now stands out. Surprisingly, the 22.5, where it didn't radically change, didn't necessarily jump out at you. And so I think persons have looked at it in terms of saying, well, now that I've crossed that sort of mental 10% barrier. When I spend $100, it's $12 I give in to the government, or $12 I'm spending. So I believe there is some of that emotional response that has led to contraction in terms of spending. But equally, it is striking the balance on price elasticity and tax elasticity. And put into layman's terms, how much can I take before I have to change my spending patterns? And there's a delicate balance.
Have we?
I'm not sure that we have analyzed it sufficiently to say that we go into it with a hope and a prayer. That let me increase it and hope that there's not a negative reversal. When we first introduced VAT, and I was a part of that exercise, the government of the day there simply had not done sufficient analysis to say what was going to be the inflation, what was going to be the actual consumer price index change. And when we did the analysis and we said over the long term, funnily enough, the 7.5 got you around 4%, which if you say something cost you last year $1, this year it cost you $1.04, you can absorb it, even though 7.5 came about. When it moved to 12.5, there was always reference to these studies that said it was not going to have a dampening effect. But it wasn't sufficient to give confidence. And I think we have to appreciate that economics is about confidence, that it is about the emotional response. So when people are in doubt, what do you do in doubt? You bunker. You go into safe haven.
Sure.
You put the money under the mattress. And so I believe that the negative outturn in the sense of not achieving the goals is not one to say, told you so, is one where a lot of persons said, you're not going to get that linear increase, because people's spending pattern, some persons, particularly those who are the bulk of it, are on the margins. And so whilst the overall increase may not be as substantive to what I'm going to say the general population, there's a significant sector in our society where that actually changed what it is they could and could not buy in the
spending
food store.
habits. Okay. Finally, we're about to take a break, but I've got to ask you this quickly. As of this month, approximately $8 billion has been approved in foreign direct investment projects. That's since May of 2017. Let's put that into context quickly. Are these projects beneficial to Bahamians? Are we going to see any great yield in return?
You know, and when we come after the break, I want to talk a little bit about the National Development Plan. But a lot went into the State of the Nation as a part of the National Development Plan. And I think a staggering statistic was when we looked at foreign direct investment, less than 20% was trickling down in the economy.
Wow.
And that is, and the DPM effectively alluded to it by saying two things happened. They have a consultant that is looking at the Bahamas Investment Authority and the investment policy of the country, which I think is a huge indicator that's saying, are we really getting the trickle-down effect that we expect? And the second aspect was the concessions that go into these projects. Because when we say $8 billion, how much do we give up as a part of that?
And that's been a hue and cry from sectors for a very long time, that we seem to give away the entire shop in order to get one purchase. If you are tuned in and enjoying our discussion, stay tuned. Our show continues right after this break. Hello and welcome to On the Record, and the balanced, true and open debate you've been looking for. We are back. Our topic tonight, crunching the budget numbers for 2019-2020. My guest is Gowan Bowe. I want to use this segment now to talk about features of the budget, some things that really stand out on this new budget. There are no new tax categories, and there is no increase in value-added tax. There was a lot of discussion about there were going to be new taxes coming, and government side called it fear-mongering. But no new tax categories, no increase in value-added tax.
And what they said is they're going to look at improving the compliance and collection aspect, which shows that we really have to revisit our overall tax infrastructure to say, is it fit for purpose going forward? I hear the cries of saying, well, if we collected all the taxes that we were supposed to, we wouldn't need to have any new taxes. Well, the reality is there's obviously something structurally wrong if we failing to do so. And it's really saying, are these effective and efficient taxes that we have? If we look at business license, the cry is, when you tax me based on my revenues, not on my profits, you could actually tax me into losses. When you look at property taxes and you're saying they're trying to increase those, really in the absence of development and any income from the property, how much is sustainable in terms of paying, and the ability to go and collect it, because if government, if you will, claims the land because of default in payment of taxes, can it sell it and recover the taxes? So there are a lot of issues that we have to look at that I would say requires the wider, mature debate around what is the appropriate tax. Every time we talk about some form of new taxes, people see it as additional tax. And I think the government needs to dispel that we collect about 20% of GDP. And GDP is the, if we want to call it, the country's income. And so government takes about 20%. So in reality, government takes about a 20% tax on the productivity of the country. That can be shared and distributed in all manner of ways. And it simply says we don't want an increase of 20% overall. But it may mean a redistribution as to who pays what, because our consumption-based tax is still very regressive in terms of the least among us pay the most relative to their income. And we have other issues in terms of the ability to enforce, because am I able to find them? But I think the government heard the cries, and whilst they had their bite at the apple took place last year. And I think they were very cautious about coming back this year to take a second bite at the apple, and so they're saying
political suicide.
Exactly. Yeah. How do we squeeze out the cloth that already exists? You know, wring it so that we get more of the revenues, not by virtue of the percentage, but by virtue of the collection. And I think that was important, because they're hitting the mid-year stream, if you will, 6 months' time, and then you're going to start the pressures around political, if you will, pressures on what should be spent on. And I believe it's important that they set the right tone now. And that goes to the National Development Plan, because I believe that even though the DPM set out there's a 3-year program that they announced last year, that still is within an election cycle. And there's always going to be distrust. And I will be the first one to say that I am one of those that has some misgivings that you are basing your fiscal strategy based on the time you win an election to the next one. Because, you know, we all come in as idealists in terms of saying, I'm going to fix things. And then
the
we get,
reality
you
sets
know,
in.
we get drunk with power and we say, well, how do I stay here?
Yeah.
Right? And that's just human nature, unfortunately.
We did a show a few weeks ago on the realities of governance.
You know, so being magnanimous is a tough one. But if we set out what I'm going to say a long-term strategy that then has incremental steps. So any 25-year, 30-year program, you know, we sometimes hear about the Chinese have 200-year programs.
Yeah.
It's got to have incremental elements to it. And I think we have to move away from this manifesto, plan, all of these documents which are really just political documents and move to a national one that says, this is how my manifesto fits into the national plan.
But they make for good, you know, political material.
Well, campaign trail.
The budget also speaks to some $28 million in reductions on customs duties. Things like refrigerators, home refrigerators, stoves are going to be duty-free. Other things like school supplies, pens, pencils, crayons, sharpeners, rulers, chart papers, all of these things are being reduced. Some of them coming in free. Things like projectors and screens are going to be reduced as well. And then you have household items, pots and pans, customs duties being reduced from 45 to 25. All household furniture, customs duties reduced from 45 to 25. Removing duty on musical instruments. This was interesting to me. Trailers for fishing boats to be eligible for duty exemption. And you see these things. And my question is, how are they going to affect the lives of Bahamian consumers every day?
And that goes to, has the government done a good enough job of articulating its strategy and where it's investing? Because what I would say is when it forgoes revenue, that's an investment in an area that you want to see development. So let's think about some of the areas that have been mentioned. So if we're talking about household items, is the strategy to try and improve what I'm going to say the real estate industry by saying encouragement of housing purchases? Because when we look, we have a significant issue of non-performing loans in the country that have homes that are in distress and dilapidated, and that is actually having a negative economic drain on the economy. And so is this a part of a wider strategy to say, well, if I reduce the cost of outfitting a home, will that provide more discretionary income?
People
I'm not saying that was
pay.
the objective, but I'm saying that
but it's a valid question,
the government should be articulating, well, this is why I'm doing so. When I do the trailer on fishing boats, is it because I'm saying my agriculture and fisheries, I want to encourage more persons to participate in that in the islands, and so I'm trying to make it cheaper for them to do so, and I am investing in the future by foregoing revenue in these areas.
To the credit, I mean, usually what will happen is once the budget presentation is made by the minister, then the individual ministers will come and be able to speak to why these initiatives and even announce more initiatives. So the next few weeks will be very interesting to see how the individual ministers will be able to speak to some of these initiatives in the budget. Another thing that that caught my attention, as of March of this year, 23,500 households have benefited from the elimination of VAT from utilities. No VAT on bills less than $300, and I think any water bills less than $50. That seems like a significant amount of people to have benefited from that, and it's something that they're going to keep in place.
What I will say is, though, and I'm one of those that criticize the imposing of exemptions because it led to the increase in the rate, meaning that when I add an exemption, it means I'm no longer earning VAT on that particular item, and so therefore I have to put the rate up to partially compensate for that exemption.
So the rest of us who over 300, we pay in.
We pay in now 12% instead of 7.5%, and that's not even a problem, because if we are able to consume that, we better be able to pay that. However, we have to be very careful about introducing exemption and saying, is it getting to the right persons? Because when we introduce the breadbasket items as being exempt, you and I consume that, and our incomes may be higher than the individual is earning $250 a week, right, or minimum wage. And so we benefit the same as they benefit, and is that equitable? So we have to look at, are the exemptions targeting the right person? So when we say, yes, 23,500 households benefited from it, the question is, okay, their electricity bill came down, but their cost of living and everything else went up.
Because in my business, if I'm a grocery store owner, and I'm paying on that. I'm paying that 12% on my electricity. I'm passing that on to the consumer.
Well, the good thing about the VAT system is that in reality, for the business, they can deduct that. Because when they sell and they charge the 12%, the answer is yes, not passing on to the consumer, meaning in their price, but in the VAT that's being charged.
Right.
And so yes, whilst the bread basket item you say may be cheaper, all other items go up.
Right.
Because they have to compensate in order to say that, you know, what I've lost in these particular areas, I have to get the revenues elsewhere. And so that's a double-edged sword that is a debate for another time. But I think when we start looking at who's being impacted, the question is, has it led to an increase in their disposable income to continue consumption to start to build the economy? Have we seen that, if you will, turn into more consumption by those same individuals, or were they already sitting on the edge, and so all this has done is allowed them to now pay a bill that they couldn't pay before, and so we're having lights off? And that's not to take away from the merit in it. It's simply to say that we have to be careful about statistics, as they say, can say anything you want them to say.
Sure.
And so when it boils down to the empirical evidence, it is really saying, well, how is that translated into either productivity or actual benefit to those individuals, as opposed to direct subvention. That would mean, okay, I charge everyone the same thing, but I make sure that the less privileged amongst us have it directly put into their pocket to afford it.
One of the areas that this budget touts is the focus on the ease of doing business. Particularly amendments to the Business License Act, which are now allowing for flexible dates for the submission and issuance of business licenses. Now, individuals with businesses can submit either March, June, September, December. Yeah. Why, for those not involved in business, why does that make sense? Why is that a good thing?
Previously, all business licenses were calendar year, January to December.
Right.
And all business license filings had to be done in January, and all payments had to be in by March.
Which is quite annoying.
So stop and think about, so let's not use the business license, let's use when you have to license your car, when it was all done in March previously.
A rush.
When you went to the last 2 days, 3 days of March, the line was wrapped around the Clarence Bain building.
For hours,
you know,
days.
And the ones there. So when you look at spreading it, what it's saying is, okay, let me make it easier, as opposed to there being a mad rush and there being backlogs in terms of approvals of licenses. Because if I have everything being done at one time, the unit is inundated during January to March. And then during the rest of the year, are they less productive because there's less activity? Whereas if you spread it out now, then you can better utilize the resources throughout the year, and businesses can choose what is the most appropriate time for me to stay out of the rush.
Why would that seem like such a significant step forward? Why would that seem to be so important? It would seem like something that would be so logical to do and would have been, but why is that something that has to be touted in such?
Set in our ways, because we've been so used to having it done this way that changing it, businesses will clamor that they've been looking for something like this for a long period of time, because when you spend 3 hours trying to pay your taxes, that's a frustration. Yeah. When you spend 2 days trying to get your license in order to clear goods from the dock and try to get your business going, because everyone is saying they have to have the certificate on the wall before you can do business, that's frustrating, and it leads to a lack of productivity and a decline in the economic activity.
Seems like a small thing, but significant.
Let's make it easier.
Yeah. Okay.
And I'm saying, if I'm paying you taxes, you shouldn't make it difficult for me to pay you taxes.
Agreed. It should be easy as possible. Yes, good point. So you are watching On the Record. Our final segment is right after this break. Stay with us.
Matt, where in the world is Matt Lauer? Where in the world is Ellison Greenslade? And so they about the low value of cottage in Atlanta. So we can talk about
On the Record tonight, the government's purchase of the Grand Lukine is a hot subject in the news. We're going to This is our final segment on the record tonight. We're crunching the numbers of the 2019-2020 budget. My guest is Gowan Bowe. He's outgoing president of the Bahamas Institute of Chartered Accountants. Under the fiscal prospects for 2019-2020, the government laid out that they have budgeted a total revenue of $2.628 billion for 2019-2020, which represents a $215 million increase over the projected outturn for 2018-2019. What's that say to you?
Well, what they're saying is they realize that they are going to come in under where they had projected for this year. And I believe that that just suggests, because there are no real new taxes, they are looking for the performance on the 12% VAT for a full year to make up for the shortfall they would have had this year that's coming to an end. And then equally, they are actually looking at the taxes that may not have been collected in like the gaming industry that the DPM is referred to. So that increase is actually a fairly modest increase and suggests that they are looking at there not being tremendous GDP growth. Because whilst 1.6 is a significant upbeat over 0.1, we have had studies that show that to reduce unemployment below 10% consistently, we need growth, nominal growth, in the area of 5% per annum. So that means real GDP somewhere in the order of 3%. So we're really half of where we want to be. And so when we put that into context, I think there's at least been realistic budgeting of the revenues, because we are saying that, look, we are not expecting or not building in any new VAT performance and any significant GDP growth. And to achieve the deficit target, obviously there's been significant spending cut, meaning whilst the expenditure has continued to grow over what is going to be the expected for this year, it is reduced in order to compensate. And the question is, have we cut in the right areas? And have we deployed resources in the right areas? And I'll go back to the capital expenditure or the infrastructure spending. We don't want to see the country go into dilapidation, right? And so there has to be a very careful management of that process. It is not one simply to say employ persons to be working on the side of the roads, cleaning and building buildings. That's not the only benefit. The actual quality of the infrastructure leads to productivity. So we have to appreciate that. And then secondly, if we don't get to the program-based spending, we really are throwing resources, because we've spoken about, I think education is going to get an increase in that one. One of the areas that I'm excited about is the small and medium-sized enterprises moving from 5 to 8.5. And I think that domestically we don't have an appreciation that we don't have a venture capital society, meaning persons who throw money at risk ventures. So we look at the banks and often criticize, well, the bank's not lending. Well, the banks are not Wizards of Oz. They don't sit behind a magic curtain. They are owned by shareholders, which are me and you. They have depositors, which are me and you, who expect when they place $100, they get it back. New banks or different banks set aside a portion of their profit or a portion of their capital to take risks. And that's not the type that has been cultivated in the Bahamas. And so when we look, the government does have a role to play in terms of helping to, if you will, provide, I'm going to say, the sharing of risk, so that institutions are not taking that on solely, but it should not be seen as a handled by government, by the recipients, because they have to see it as government lending them. And government needs to take a very hard stance that if you don't pay it back, they're coming after my assets.
You mentioned two things, and I'm glad you did. It was on my list here. An additional $20 million will be allocated to education and training in the budget, commencing with the first phase of a $9.3 million project to enhance BTVI. So that was very significant. Also, $170 million over the next 8 to 10 years to introduce commercial solar scale energy opportunities throughout the Bahamas. Those things in particular caught my attention because it would seem as if there is some effort now to invest in some things which could substantially improve. We spoke about our people being employable. We also spoke about, just a moment ago, what we are paying in electricity bills, and so now you're looking at solar energy opportunities. Are these the positive, progressive things that need to be happening?
Well, certainly, and I think when we look at our education spend, one of the largest budgets that gets allocated, but we always look and say, well, we have this D average, and let's forget the D average. We just have persons coming out of school that are not employable, that are missing the skills. And so to me, this is one of those, when we talk about program-based spending, that makes sense.
Right.
So I'm actually going to train persons in vocations. I'm going to say that not everyone is going to be, in terms of the traditional classes where they are the strongest, right? So we think about our forefathers, some of the most successful businessmen were carpenters, were masons, were persons that were talented with their hands. And they learned from apprenticeship type arrangements where they learned from their fathers and their grandfathers, etc. And we lost that. So building that back makes a tremendous amount of sense. And when we think about renewables, the reality is the world itself has to look at this whole global warming. It has to look at fossil fuels and the evaporation of those. And it has to say, well, how do we move ourselves to be able to actually have energy that in the future, right, will be sourced in a different way? And I think those types of investments go back to saying you can see snippets of long-term plans by the government. You don't see enough of saying, well, what am I looking forward to for the next 25 years, regardless of whether I'm here as the administration? And that's where I think, or I hope, over the course of the debate, there's more articulation on that.
One thing, I've got to go quickly, that really stuck out to me is this new procurement department, which will publish an annual report which lists all government contracts awarded. Thus, payments will be able to see listed in one place which individuals and companies have received their tax dollars for the performance of government contracts. A very sore issue for a very long time. Who's getting what? How are they spending our money? But now this is going to be centralized and publicized for all of us to see.
And I think that that's moving in the right direction. That when we look at our neighbor to the north, don't be fooled to believe that there isn't some patronizing of persons that are supporters, because lobbying takes place. However, it is how much of that is concealed. And I think having a supplier registry that they refer to. So these are the persons that are approved, right? So when you talk about, well, this person don't even have a business license, or he don't even have the skill set. He only opened his business yesterday. How we get that contract?
Right, and
hopefully this will allow you to see better, well, are these businesses that are registered? Because you should see them on the VAT list. You should see them in terms of business license registration. You should have some understanding of what they are. And then being able to report back and say, this is what I've spent my money on and who with. I think is going to be a tremendous tool to speak to how we're spreading the wealth. Because government is probably the largest spender of resources when we think about our economy. And you think about their expenditure of $2.6 billion thereabouts. 30% goes into salaries, about 800 million a year. But the rest of it is on goods and services. And so when you put that into perspective, government spending, over $1 billion, whether it's up to 1.5, in the economy, is a tremendous amount going into it. And the question is the government spreading the wealth? Because they have the capacity, if you will, to diversify, because they're the biggest budget and the biggest spenders.
Carmen, I think my producer's telling me we're out of time. Is that it? We're out of time. I think we are. Very quickly, I want you to wrap up. Sort of, what are some of the key indicators as consumers and as Bahamians that we need to be looking out for in this budget cycle now to tell us that we are on the right or the wrong track? Just on our day to day, what should we be looking for that says, okay, we're going in the right direction, or hey, wait a minute, we're heading down the wrong track?
I think there's some looking at the quality of infrastructure, when we look at roads, utilities, buildings, are we maintaining those, and are we bringing them so that we feel comfortable doing business with government is the first thing. Secondly, are we getting the social services we need, not the social services we're asking for? Because we want government to provide everything. And government needs to say this is what it is, focus its attention on, and it is doing it well. So we feel like we're getting value for money. And then I think ultimately, let's not be afraid to ask the questions of our ministers in terms of saying, are you spending it the right way? So yes, a budget, I will go back to saying, is only a plan, or a goal, I should say. But a goal without a plan is just a wish, Antoine de Saint-Exupéry. And so what we want to see is the various ministries, how are they devising plans to implement this budget strategy in order to achieve the goals we've set? And I think that when we look back at it, not everything is going to be to the naked eye easily seen. But if we are not certain, then we should be able to ask that question, and government should be prepared, particularly when they get the comments back from a council, be able to answer them and say, when we answer, we are mature. We're not criticizing the criticism we've received.
Certainly.
We are answering to say that if this is a question and we can't answer it, we better go find the answer.
Good point. So thank you very much for coming and talking with us today. You know, budgets are always complex things, particularly for those of us who are not in that business. So thank you for...
It's not easy for us in the business.
Good to know. So thank you for helping us to, be able to navigate through some of that information. And certainly we appreciate you coming on today, as always.
Always a pleasure.
So we hope that you have enjoyed our show tonight. Special thanks to my guest, Mr. Gowan Bowe. Also special thanks to my producer and technical staff. On behalf of all of us, thank you so much for watching. I'm your host, Jerome Sawyer. We'll see you next time right here on The Record.